Positively positive procurement through supplier diversity. So how does it work?
The RBA's official rates are at 4.35%. And they've been there for some time. They had 13 interest rate rises, but they've been there for some time.
Eden Park has been committed to continually to challenge what a stadium utilisation looks like and evolving as market demands change.
He referred to the CE and the GM as making a mockery of the public service and referred to them as white privileged rednecks being everywhere, which is quite a case.
New Zealand should be very careful about walking into AUKUS Pillar 2 because Chinese consumers punish countries that they feel don't align with their values.
Welcome to the Weekly Wrap, where we go over the top video stories from the past week. First up, Mike McRoberts investigates business-to-business positive procurement and how it aims to level the playing field.
Whoever described procurement as the boring revolution clearly wasn't at last month's inaugural Amutai Supplier Diversity Awards.
We'll make Whakapaki stronghold for it.
Boring? No. Revolutionary? Well, how's this from the Supplier of the Year winners, Quincy and Karali Tangio?
Very happy to receive the award because all the nominees there tonight were awesome.
Amazing.
And the thing what I loved about it is that everyone shares the same kupapa, the values, the principles of why they're doing it. It's awesome.
This is for your mum. She'll be so proud of you.
Yeah, but yeah, it goes to mum and our team, but also my wife Cara.
Positively positive procurement through supplier diversity. So how does it work? First off, as a nation, we've very much come late to this party. Born out of the US civil rights movement more than 50 years ago, positive, progressive or social procurement is now firmly entrenched in many other countries like the UK, Canada, South Africa, even Australia. It's all about building more equitable and inclusive supply chains and a stronger, broader economy. Created within Auckland Council 6 years ago, Amutai embraces the global strategy of supplier diversity. Amutai means swell in the tide, a tide that can carry all waka to new horizons. That tide is social, progressive or positive procurement, and the waka are Māori and Pasifika businesses. Business is one way Māori and Pasifika can build their wealth for their families and their communities. As this Amutai animation explains, supplier diversity is all about getting more Māori and Pasifika businesses previously hard to access contract opportunities with government agencies, local councils, private enterprises, iwi, and other not-for-profit organisations.
Who would have thought being a Māori entrepreneur was a thing, right? You know, I mean, I didn't even think there was such a thing.
Warner Cowan's had a lifelong passion for heights and all things aerial. 25 years ago, after finishing his engineering degree, he joined the Royal New Zealand Air Force. The young officer was soon deployed to East Timor as part of a United Nations peacekeeping force, tasked with helping the fledgling nation keep its newly voted for independence. Still in his early 20s, the conflict and the country made an impression on Warner and how he viewed his future prospects back in New Zealand.
We have the base for anyone to be a success in this country. And I think fundamentally when I look at our Māori businesses is that, you know, entrepreneurship and the ability to engage with, with government or the business sector that is relatively free of corruption is one of the greatest things we have in this country. We can have the ability to grow a business, to invest in ourselves, to create wealth, which we invest in our families and our communities. I think that's the thing I think about all the time when I reflect back on my time in Timor.
Of Ngāti Porou descent on his father's side and Pākehā on his mother's, Warner Cowan has become adept at working in that space between two cultures.
I didn't explore the Māori language side of me until I was in the service, and the only reason that happened because there was no Māori officers and I was the only guy, right? So that was the start of that journey, and I still probably feel more of an imposter in the Māori side of things. Am I Māori enough? Do I know enough te reo Māori to be be competent or have the ability to be legitimate in that space.
You learn pretty quickly when you're the only Māori in the room, don't you?
Yeah, well, you do. You know what it's like, right? But also, I think that I bring a skill set because, again, from being an engineer and particularly having worked on large infrastructure projects, I've got plenty of cousins that speak beautiful te reo Māori. I bring a different skill sets, and I've reconciled that in terms of my ability to contribute.
They were humble beginnings for his company Height, which started 11 and a half years ago in a garage in the Auckland suburb of Sandringham, pitching for infrastructure projects. It was a tough start. I love a quote of yours, which was something along the lines of, "Give us your shittiest jobs."
Yeah, that was, when we started this business, the first thing I did when I was pitching for work was I'd go and see my colleagues, people who knew me and trusted me. I said, look, just give me your shittiest project and I'll deliver it for you. Because
did you?
Yeah. I built wastewater treatment plants in Whanganui and did stormwater stuff here and there. But, I learned over that time, what it was to run a business. And anyone who has a perception of what their business will look like in 10 years, well, mine evolved and it's very, very different from what I intended to start with.
Height is now recognised as being Australasia's leading technical and social procurement consultancy, employing 42 staff across New Zealand and Australia, using the company's own experiences to help others.
The important thing when you work with a bureaucracy, in particular a government organisation, is how do you systematise that? How do you create the rules and the process associated with dissecting a large project and looking to how do you implement this stuff? So we developed a number of frameworks and toolboxes, and that's really important because government people follow process. So when you're looking at implementing these systems or ideas, it has to be transparent, it has to be auditable. And the other thing we've done a lot of is a lot of our tools that we create, we open source them. So we give them away, we create momentum around them, so that puts us at the centre of that conversation as well. So not about just holding back, but it's about making sure that we can implement these things throughout. All organisations get the opportunity.
So your mahi has become helping others with theirs?
100%, yeah. For us as a business, people won't say, well, you're giving away IP. The reality is things are bouncing around all the time, and people will use good ideas. But, the hardest part is not the IP itself, it's implementing the cultural change around that.
Thanks again, Mike. And for more on that, head to the Te Ao Māori section here at mbr.co.nz. Well, let's head over the ditch where Australia's cash rate sits at 4.35%, but even that is not low enough for Treasurer Jim Chalmers. For more on the friction between the RBA and the Aussie government, here's our correspondent in Sydney, Lachlan Colquhoun.
Interest rates are always a controversial subject when they are higher than people would like, and that has been the case in New Zealand, but also in Australia. Across the ditch, Australian Treasurer Jim Chalmers launched an attack on the RBA's monetary policy last week and blamed its high rates for crashing the economy. It might have been a good populist line, but the reality is a little more complex than that. To make sense of Chalmers' attack and to understand its context, I'm joined by NBR's Sydney correspondent Lachlan Colquhoun, who is writing about this in his Underarm column this week. Hi, Lachlan.
I will.
Can you just recap on what Chalmers actually said and why he's done that?
Yeah, well, it was an extraordinary attack on the Reserve Bank. Usually the politicians are very deferential to the RBA. Yeah, as you said, Chalmers' main thrust was that the RBA's interest rate policies were crashing the economy and strangling growth. Put that in perspective, the RBA's official rates are at 4.35%. And they've been there for some time. They had 13 interest rate rises, but they've been there for some time. And they're still lower than they are in New Zealand after you've had your cut. But Chalmers' point is that we need a rate cut to get the economy moving. And he's blaming the RBA for the state of the economy and the fact that this economy has essentially stalled. It was all made worse by a pile-on from other Labor figures, some of whom are not even in government anymore. Former Treasurer Wayne Swan said the RBA was putting economic dogma over rational decision-making. So really it was an unprecedented, certainly over the last few years, attack on the Reserve Bank from the government.
So what is the RBA's actual position?
Well, the RBA Governor, Michelle Bullock, continues to focus on inflation. which is at 3.8%, and the RBA has a target of between 2 and 3% for inflation before it could even consider cutting rates. So she says that inflation's poison for the economy, and that higher interest rates, or the current interest rate settings we have right now, are the antidote for inflation. So she's ruled out a rate cut this year, and she's even said that if inflation persists, they might raise rates, and if people are hurting, they should consider selling their homes. So that wasn't very empathetic from her. It didn't win her much popularity. But Bullock didn't point this out, but others have, and they've said that government spending is fueling inflation. The May budget had $24 billion in tax cuts and spending. This is obviously going to add to the economy and drive inflation a little bit higher. So there's an argument that government spending is preventing inflation falling to a point where the RBA could consider cutting rates.
So where is the economy at in its current cycle, in your estimation?
Well, I think it's stalled. By any measure, it's stalled. And national accounts last week had 0.2% growth for the June quarter. That puts annual growth at 1.5%. That's anemic. On an annual basis, if you strip out migration, we're in a per capita recession and have been for some time. Inflation's proving very sticky. Cost of living is going up as wages aren't keeping pace with inflation, and unemployment's creeping higher at 4.2%. So economists are predicting an eventual soft landing sometime next year, but there are many risks out there, and one of the big ones that they're seeing is what's happening with the Chinese economy, because if the Chinese economy crashes, then a whole export trade, particularly of iron ore and coal, will take a big hit.
So what are the political implications of all of this?
Well, it's nothing if not political, of course. And I should start with a bit of a mea culpa, actually, because after the government brought down their May budget, I wrote that I thought that it was an election budget and we would have an election this year. I still think they would be in a better position to win an election if they had gone early. They're obviously not going early. But people are blaming the government and not the RBA for the cost of living. And the longer we go on, the more chance there is for the opposition to get some momentum out of the state of the economy. So recent polls had the Coalition and Labor tied 50-50 on two-party preferred. So we're really heading for a minority government, which would be a Labor coalition with the Greens, which would be unprecedented in Australia. I mean, Labor have been in a minority government situation before, but it's been with independents. It hasn't been with an organised mainstream political party like the Greens, who get about 12% of the vote. And the impact of that would be, if they had to placate the Greens and go into a coalition with them, they'd have to adopt some of their more left-wing policies, which they've been very painstaking, Labor, to be as moderate as possible so as not to alienate middle Australia. So it's in a conundrum, but the government have left things drift. The economy is not getting any better, and they're increasingly vulnerable to the attacks from the opposition. So in some ways, they should have taken my advice and gone for an early election.
And Lachlan will be back with another Underarm column next week. I still don't trust my CEO. You can add that to a list of phrases that could get you sacked for serious misconduct at the Mackenzie District Council. Duncan Cotterill, Senior Associate Jeremy Ansell, has the latest for this week's Toil and Trouble.
An employee who was dismissed after putting up a sign saying, "I still don't trust my CEO," provides some useful lessons on the duty of fidelity and getting disciplinary processes right, according to Duncan Cotterill, Senior Associate, Jeremy Ansell. Jeremy, it sounds like an interesting case. Why don't we start with the facts first and then we can get into what it means?
Sure, yes. It's one of these quirky cases that you see from an employer in a small area, perhaps. There's three relevant characters that we need to know about. The first is the employee, Mr. Homison. He was working for the council in an employment development role. There was the CEO of the council, of Mackenzie District Council, Ms. Oysterhuizen, and a Mr. Dixon, who was a general manager. Now, unbelievably, the three of them had all worked together before at a previous employer. Now, we don't know what happened in that circumstance, but we do know that Mr. Homison's role was disestablished, and he appeared to carry over some angst and some animosity towards those two staff members as a result of whatever had happened for the previous employer. We also know that Mr. Homison had taken a personal grievance against the CEO of the council, and that this was continuing on at the same time as the disciplinary matter, which I'll get to.
Right.
That matter had gone to employment mediation, as many matters do, but it had been unresolved at that stage. Mr. Homison clearly had some ill feeling towards his CE, and right before he went to go on the employment mediation to deal with the matter he had directly against the CE, he put up a sign at his workstation. It was an open plan environment, and the sign said, "I still don't trust my CEO," in capital letters and exclamation marks, etc. His argument was that he did not actually write that specifically that day, and that he had previously written this on a 360 feedback form. It was one of those organisations that engages in 360 feedback, and they want to hear everybody's feedback on their colleagues. So he says he had found that sign while he was preparing for the employment mediation he was about to do with the CE. He then puts it up on his corkboard or whatever he has next to his desk, and a couple of employees go past and they see the sign and obviously form a negative view about it. It stays up for a little while before it's ultimately removed, but the employer took it very seriously. They considered it to be a breach of good faith and a breach of his duty of fidelity, and they ended up commencing a disciplinary process in relation to that.
Yeah, so what is that duty of fidelity then?
Duty of fidelity is it's in all employment relationships. It basically means faithfulness. You have to show faithfulness to your employer. You have to deal with them in good faith and in good intention, and you should not do anything contrary to that. And obviously the employer, you would assume, would have a legitimate argument that putting up a sign criticising them in that way is potentially going to be a breach of that duty. So they commenced a process.
So how did the process play out? Obviously, they tried to dismiss him, or they did dismiss him?
They did ultimately dismiss him on account of breach of duty of fidelity. They also said that he'd brought the employer into disrepute. They followed a fairly standard process, but the ERA ultimately picked that apart and found that there were defects in the process, and that they were major defects and not minor defects. They held a initial disciplinary meeting with him on a Friday where they put these matters to him. He was unrepresented at that meeting. His explanations were many and varied, including that he, as I said before, he had not written the sign for that occasion. It was something that had previously been written. He wasn't trying to draw attention to the message. I'm not sure that's that convincing, because if that's the case, then why would you put it up in the first place?
Yeah.
He also said that it was only seen by a couple of employees and there was no widespread sort of damage to the organisation. The employer considered those explanations. They appointed the CE, the same CE that he had the existing claim against, as the decision maker for the process. They then adjourned very briefly. They had a second disciplinary meeting on the Monday following the weekend, so only one working day preparation. They heard some further explanations from him. In the second meeting, he made a number of critical comments about the organisation as a whole and his dissatisfaction with the CE. He referred to the CE and the GM as making a mockery of the public service, and referred to them as white privileged rednecks being everywhere, which is quite strong comments.
Yeah.
The employer and the CE ultimately found that there was serious misconduct, and they dismissed him from his employment.
The ERA later on, though, found that this was unjustified. All about the process here, or
they did, primarily about the process.
Yep.
They don't talk too much about what's called substantive justification, but where they appear to land is that dismissing an employee for putting up a sign of that type was a decision open to a fair and reasonable employer to make, and that's effectively the legal test.
Yep.
But what they did scrutinise quite closely was the employer's process. They looked a lot at Section 103A of the Act, which is called the test for justification. There's various things an employer has to do under that section when you're contemplating dismissing somebody, including sufficiently investigating the allegations, giving the employee a reasonable chance to comment, and genuinely considering the explanation. So it's not enough just to hear the explanation. You actually have to turn your mind to it as a decision maker and give it some thought as to whether you accept the explanation or not. In this case, they found that the council had failed to genuinely consider the explanations. They'd also failed to put one of their reasons to him for comment, which was that they considered the matter had brought the whole organisation into disrepute.
Right.
Maybe difficult to see how they could land there. The sign was only seen by a couple of employees. It's not as though the person posted it on social media. And they also took issue with the very, very quick timeframes that the employer had put in place. And we see this time and time again. Having one working day between a first and a second disciplinary meeting is never going to clear your hurdle for fair process.
So obviously, as with all these things, very fact-specific, but, I mean, there must be some broader lessons that people can take away from this one as well?
Absolutely. Disciplinary processes and investigations are a minefield for employers, obviously, but there are some key lessons that companies can take away from this. The first criticism and another criticism that the ERA laid with the process was that the choice of decision maker was incorrect for this matter. So every disciplinary process, somebody has to make the decision, and even if it's a wider group of people making the decision, like a school board or something, for example, there still has to technically be one decision maker. In this case, they found that it was not appropriate for the CE to be acting as decision maker, given there were clearly interpersonal issues between the employee and her. There was already an existing personal grievance. So the first lesson probably is to make sure you get your decision maker right. If there's any reason whatsoever that somebody might be conflicted or there's an existing issue, anything that points to potential bias, predetermination, unfairness, consider putting somebody else in there as decision maker to the extent that you can.
Well, to host more concerts, you have to break a few walls. Eden Park Chief Executive Nick Sautner jumped into a digger recently to help dismantle the stadium's lower west stand as it gears up to cater for a doubling in the number of concerts and events.
Tell us in a nutshell what your plans are for the stadium and what you're doing behind you.
Eden Park has been committed to continually to challenge what a stadium utilisation looks like and evolving as market demands change. The Lower West Stand is a project that we're looking to implement over the next 2 weeks. Demolition of a stand that was built in the early 90s that will enable a greater capacity for concerts, a better ingress and egress for fan experience, and then looking at some alternate hospitality options for our sports content.
What will those hospitality options look like?
We're looking at 2 options, one being 5 sideline supporter suites, whereby the trend internationally is that fans are looking to get close to the action, whether it be through supporters clubs, field clubs, etc., or indeed a premium offering for membership that would now enable up to 1,000 members the right to access sport and entertainment for all year round.
And you're looking at reusing and recycling the products you're taking out. How will that work, and why are you doing that?
So Eden Park has a sustainability plan that is committed to adaptive reuse. We know that we're in a climate emergency, and mitigating our carbon emissions whilst utilising existing infrastructure is needed. We are now going to be in a situation in early 2026 to have a CRL on our doorstep, 6 to 7 minutes to town, and we need to ensure that we get greater utilisation of existing infrastructure.
And that extends to how many seats in that stand?
The stand is, we're reducing the capacity by 1,200 seats to enable this new installation, but that enables us to have greater flexibility. So on event days we can have either a standing room area, temporary seating, retractable stands, or even boundary barbecues.
Awesome. Can you give me an idea as to the cost implications for this project?
So the first stage is around $2.5 million, where the further stage could be in the vicinity of $10 million.
And how does this fit in with your longer term vision?
This is part of our ongoing commitment to ensure that Eden Park is here for another 100 years. We need to ensure that the venue has greater utilisation and is catering for the demand of the market. So as I mentioned, that now we're seeing corporates wanting to be close to the action. We've experienced this overseas, now we want to bring that to New Zealand. It's not a product currently available in this market, and as the national stadium we believe that we can lead the hospitality offering across all stadiums in the country.
Are you taking your lead from any international experiences?
Yeah, I've been fortunate enough to visit in the US, 12 venues in 5 days, and there's no question that this is something that has been implemented in the likes of SoFi Stadium or Allegiant Stadium, whereby the fans get that almost touching the player's experience, but also then a deliver to the door service where you can get either a cab or an Uber right to the door.
And you're looking at increasing the number of different type of events outside of obviously rugby. I mean, you've got a full concert slate coming up. Can you talk about that?
Our commitment over the last 5 years is to see greater utilisation of the facility and diversification of content. We held 3 Women's World Cups in a 3-year period and was seen as the benchmark for the FIFA Women's World Cup with 9 fixtures in 27 days and 350,000 patrons. 70% of today's attendance and revenue wasn't part of our business model 5 years ago. So it demonstrates that a need for transformational change at our national stadium, and we're very proud that our 3,000 staff on event days, or indeed our 41 staff on non-event days, can deliver that change that the country needs.
And you've got consent for more concerts, for example, as well?
We're working through a consent process currently. Currently we're restricted to 6 shows, and this year we'll see 2 Pink concerts, 3 Coldplay and 1 Travis Scott. Unfortunately, we're seeing artists that can't now come to our national stadium this year because of that restriction. We are in the process with council to increase that to 12, and we've been delighted with the community support, and 97%, the last figure I saw, of submissions were in support of our concert consent, with over 2,000 submissions in support. The community is behind us with 12 schools, 150 businesses and over 1,500 houses, part of our supporters club called The Hood, and we engage with them on a daily basis to ensure that our operations are good for the community and good for the country.
Now to China. Made in New Zealand still has a cachet in the country. However, Shoeshine examines how consumers are increasingly quick to punish countries they see as against Chinese interests.
In what's her last Shoeshine this week, Dita Daboni has spoken to 4 NZ companies doing business in China to ask them what kind of economic situation they are seeing in this critical market right now and the strategies they are using to adapt to their new reality there. Dita, tell us about China's economic situation.
I'll try and keep it brief because it's a rather large topic. But essentially, China's growth has slowed. So, its GDP, which is supposed to be over 5% this year, might be less or around that. I mean, that's still pretty stupendous GDP growth, really. But by the standards of China, it has slowed. And consumers, there's soft demand. The real estate market there is in trouble. So altogether, it's flowing through into very soft consumer demand. Yeah.
Okay. So, I mean, how are we actually seeing that in terms of the consumer demand and its impact on New Zealand's exports?
So, New Zealand exports many things to China, and for many companies, most companies, probably China is their biggest market. New Zealand products traditionally have attracted a premium because they seem to be quality and they seem to be, the best quality and safe and so forth. What's happened, though, is that Chinese consumers are looking to spend a bit less, and while they've had COVID, these foreign companies haven't been operating in their full capacity in China, and the domestic players have upped their game quite substantially. So I think what's happened for premium quality brands like those coming from New Zealand is that increasingly they have the competition of the domestic producers to deal with, as well as, quality from other countries like the Nordic countries in America and so forth. So it's a highly competitive market, and the Chinese consumer is very discerning.
I mean, it makes sense, doesn't it, that the middle class is growing in the consumer market, that there's going to be a better quality domestic market eventually. I mean, exporters, you talk to Fonterra and Silver Fern Farms, they must have perhaps known that this was going to happen, or how are they reacting?
They knew that this was going to happen, and things have happened in China, such as their cold chains and their supply chains have got a lot better over the COVID period, because I think in China the government actually puts money into these things and wants its infrastructure to be the very best. So they've adapted to that by deciding to look into China's tier 2, 3 and 4 cities and work out how to best, because those cities are poorer, they're smaller, they're still enormous by New Zealand standards, but slightly poorer, and they haven't quite got the sophisticated retail offering that the Beijings and the Shanghais have, but it's getting there. So they've got to work out now to meet that growing middle class in those cities. They've got to meet it with these premium goods, against, again, this massive competition.
You also spoke to Grin Natural. How are they finding the market?
So Grin Natural, and I think you've done a story on these guys yourself about how much success they've had with, what are they called, like influencers on social media. It's a New Zealand company run by a man who was originally from China. They're selling toothpaste and things into the market. He's saying, because he's got to grips with social media so incredibly well and e-commerce channels, and I think obviously being a native Chinese speaker and knowing the country must help him to some degree, but he really understands the new platforms that are coming up, and there are many of them. And actually, Chinese consumers are becoming more nationalistic, so they're kind of rejecting to some degree the big American channels and and they're going with their own. So he has an understanding of that. I think it's a buffer against, lower consumer demand or more competitive pressures.
Mm-hmm. And MitoQ, the supplements company, they're seeking to understand different regions within the country.
They are. So they're also going out into the tier 2, 3, 4 cities, and they're there where there are, trade shows and things in these smaller cities. And what MitoQ's Mahara Inglis said to me is that Australia is sending, whole state delegations to these trade shows because they know the opportunity is there. So that's quite interesting. Mm. Yeah.
And so what's the government's role in all of this?
Well, it's a controversial point, but I would say the government's main role in New Zealand is twofold. One, through NZTE, which they do a very good job already with exporters and really keeping abreast of what's going on in China. The other thing I would say, more controversially, is that New Zealand should be very careful about walking into AUKUS Pillar 2, because Chinese consumers punish countries that they feel don't align with their values. And that's fair. All consumer markets probably do the same. So I think if New Zealand sleepwalks into that, who knows what pressure's going on behind the scenes, but if they do that, there will be repercussions, and I think it's going to be very worrying for the many companies that rely on the Chinese consumer market.
Thanks again for joining us. For all the business news you can use, head to mbr.co.nz. See you next week.